Hello, here's May and welcome to this video in which I'll be talking about my process of creating 3 different Mermay illustrations. I went with drawing some Genshin Impact characters for this, since I really enjoy drawing them and I think many other people would enjoy seeing some Genshin Impact characters as mermaids or mermen. The ones I drew were just mermen, and this way I could practice my anatomy knowledge a little bit, which I don't do that often since I rarely draw naked upper bodies, and I thought this was a good opportunity to practice this while also drawing some cool characters and also learning to draw fish tails. And in this video we'll take a look at 3 illustrations, and in the next video I'll be talking about 3 more illustrations. Overall I drew 6 Mermay illustrations, and it was a very cool, fun process to me. Before starting to draw digitally, I first made some thumbnail sketches traditionally, where I figured out some nice poses, and I found this very interesting since normally when you pose a character they have 2 legs and the silhouette would look differently, but when you just have like this fishtail, it changes up the options you have for creating poses. And also overall I wanted to try to get this watery, flowy feeling in the pose, especially with the tail. You can like have it curve a lot and so on, which I found very cool to figure out in posing the characters. But now let's get started with the actual drawing processes. First off, we'll have a look at Zhao. I went with this pose where he was kind of facing the viewer backwards, since I thought he hides his emotions or in general what he thinks often. I wanted to practice drawing the upper body from different angles, which this was useful for practicing the back. And I had some back references and general upper body anatomy references up on a reference board while drawing these. I also had some references of the characters, of course, and I also wanted to emphasize the flowy hair, since in the water, your hair floats around, and I also made the hair of most of the characters a little longer or more voluminous. For Zhao, for his fishtail, this is where I put in the most variation, I think. For all the different illustrations is with the tail and the shape, and I wanted it to have like this kind of sharper shape. And when starting to draw Zhao, I wasn't sure about the head orientation at first. I didn't know if I wanted it to be sideways or just 3/4 looking back, and I went with the looking back, since I thought it would make the illustration more interesting if you see a little more of the face. And here you can see me adding different patterns and tattoos to the illustration, and I did this for some of the drawings. And for this one in particular, Zhao's tattoo, drawing it was following a reference closely, was the way I went for this. I find this tattoo very cool and it made the whole illustration a lot better, since often when I draw like upper bodies or something like naked bodies, I find they just look so empty when you just have this white area of skin where you don't really have any other colors. So I thought that this was interesting, and I also added some tattoos for some of the other characters that I don't really have, but I thought it made the whole illustration look more interesting. And since the characters here would be kind of reimagined in what they would be like as mermen, why not change up the design a little bit? For Zhao, the palette or the colors I used were just inspired by his original outfit, which is just purple and some green and also gold, but the green is really just for the hair and the tattoo. And the fishtail, this was with purples and some gold patterns. And you can see me adding some of these smaller, I don't know what it's called, but smaller tail things at the side of his tail, since I thought it would make the whole illustration look a little more interesting. And I did this with some of the other illustrations as well. For the tail, I also added a pattern, so I downloaded a few textures for this and I just put them on top of the tail, since similarly to the skin, I don't like it when a big area just has one flat color. I think it can look very nice on some sides, but I thought it looked a little empty, so I added this pattern. You could also just add some gradients or something like that. But now let's move on to the next character, which is Ether. And for Ether, I went with a pose where he was also kind of facing backwards to the viewer. As I said before, I really wanted to focus on the flow of the whole pose, that it has this nice S-curve. And for Ether, I found it very cool that he has a braid and you can play around with the braid a lot. And here you can see me also changing up the arm pose. And in the end, I went with one arm pose at first and then I added a second one, since I thought that the one I drew at first, I just wanted to know how the other pose would look. At first I drew this pose where he was stretching his arms forward. With Ether's braid, anytime I draw him, I find it's a lot of fun to figure out where braids would go, or just where long hair would flow. I don't often draw long hair and I find it pretty difficult, but at the same time it's a lot of fun to figure out where the strands would go. Always with hair, it's such an interesting process to kind of balance it out, that the hair looks believable, that there are a similar amount of strands everywhere in the hairstyle. I also looked at some anatomy references for this, just like with Zhao, and I mainly noticed this middle line in the back you have, and then you have like some side lines which they shift depending on how you have your arms. They indicate the shoulder blades and the back muscles. And here when Ether was stretching his arms forward, they went kind of up, and if Ether was putting his arms downwards, they would go down. You can see the difference in both versions I drew with what I mean, but for his palette I went with a gold palette, a bright gold in this case. At first I wanted to include a more darker gold, but I didn't really like how it looked, so I went with this. And you can also see that for the fishtail, I think the meeting point of I just looked it up, the meeting point of the fin and the tail is too small, in my opinion. It doesn't look very realistic, but in the beginning it was the other way around. To me, it was too big. Yeah, that's definitely something you can learn while drawing fishtails. And here I'm adding the second variation of the arm pose. You can also see I included this star pattern and diamond pattern, and in general I wanted to include different patterns on the tail and the tattoos for the characters that should resemble a little bit of the original character design of the characters. I find this is always a lot of fun to be inspired by some other character designs and try to come up with something new from them. And for Ether, I also struggled with his head pose in the beginning, since he was kind of looking upwards while his back was facing the viewer. I haven't really drawn the head in this particular angle before, so that was interesting to do. But now let's move on to the last character for this video, which is Venti. And for Venti, I went with this pose where he was just, I would say it's kind of a more generic mermaid pose maybe, since it's just like this 3/4 view and facing the front, and one of the arms is raised up. You can see that I experimented with some head pieces and so on, with some flowers and other accessoires, and in the end I decided to go with one headband. I also wanted to implement a crown at some point to kind of resemble Venti's headpiece, his head, which he has in the original game, but I just went with this since I thought the crown would make the design stand out too much compared to the other designs. I mean, technically in the game, Venti is one of the gods, so maybe it would fit in the Mermaid Kingdom. Yeah, I just went with this headpiece and then also a necklace. And you can see that I added these side things to his tail, which I also did for Zhao, but here I did 2 of them. And I also added a small tattoo to his stomach and then some patterns on his tail as well. And I'm not really sure about how muscular he looks. As mentioned before, I haven't drawn the naked torso, especially in the colored and shaded version often. I have done some anatomy drawings, but only with pencils and this is different from that, definitely. And because of that, because I haven't had much experience with this, I don't really know what I want it to look like, since the more often I draw something, it's easier for me to get an idea of, okay, I like how this looks and I don't like how this looks and something like that. I'm not really sure about the body type, so of course I would draw the younger Genshin male characters less muscular and skinnier than the more grown-up ones. But I don't know if the way I did it looks believable. Maybe they look too muscular or too thin, and in general I have a preference of drawing my characters rather skinny and not muscular, since that's my stylistic preference and also the way I'm used to do it. When drawing the upper body, I wanted to practice some anatomy, and because of that I included some anatomy indications. Also, what I did for these drawings, which is a little different from the way I drew before, it was how I shaded the hair. So before I only did like flat colors and maybe 2 layers of shading or 1 layer and then some highlights. And for the Mermay illustrations, since I really wanted the flowy hair to stand out, I decided to try a more painterly shading, adding more detail to it with some brush strokes. And I used a brush that has like pressure sensitivity and also different opacity. I really enjoyed doing that. It's not as hard as drawing line art and so on. It can also be very relaxing, but I wouldn't enjoy doing it for a super long time. So I don't think I would try to do this on a whole piece with all the clothing or something. I can imagine when you would draw a dress, for example, with many folds, it can get very tedious. But I enjoyed using this technique for the hair, definitely. And you can see that at first I wanted Venti's tail to be blue, but then I changed it up to be turquoise, which I'm glad about it. I think the color combination in the end looks nice, also with the small pink flower accents. After doing some regular cell shading, I also did some gradients for the shading in the end for all of the characters. For the backgrounds for the illustrations, I used some textures. I downloaded them online from a page that's called RawPixel, where you can find some free texture and shape elements, and I really wanted to try to use some of them for the illustrations, since I thought that the watercolor texture patterns would really fit to the Mermay feel. I experimented with some of them and combined them to have the shapes look nice with the pose, which is also fun to do. That's how I went about assembling the backgrounds for these illustrations. But that's it for the process I went with when drawing these characters. I hope you enjoyed watching my drawing process and listening to my ideas I had while drawing. You can comment which of the drawings you like the most, or if you have tried out some challenges like Mermay before, because this was the first time for me and it was a lot of fun. But I didn't do it every day, something like that. I just went with 6 illustrations, but I think with these challenges you can take it as far as you want. You can try them out, you don't have to try them out. I just found that I really wanted to try out this one, so I went with it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you like this one you can look forward to the next one with 3 more Genshin Impact characters. Thanks a lot for watching and have a great day. Goodbye!